Welcome back to the No Homework Book Club. Today we're covering Chapter 6 of Mike Cohn's Agile Estimating and Planning. This chapter is over techniques for estimating, so it's going to be a good one. Let's dive into it. The first thing that we're talking about here is the level of effort that gets put into estimating a software project, an epic, a user story itself, or even a task. And the first thing that the book talks about is really the diminishing return on your time compared to the accuracy of your estimate. The book puts up this chart, as you see, and I don't know how scientific this is, if it's meant to be more rhetorical. I would imagine that's probably the truth, but this is effort versus accuracy. And the point is that a little bit of time can give you a really good estimate. About 10% of your effort gets you 50% of your potential accuracy. And then the more time that you put into an estimate, you do start to flatline and then ultimately maybe even become less accurate. I'm not sure why that would be the case, except maybe that you're just making too many assumptions. The book goes on to detail that if your project is, if you're trying to spend way too much time getting very high into the accuracy of your estimates, you're going to suffer from a few pitfalls. One is that estimates are still, at the end of the day, estimates. They're only going to be as accurate as you can possibly get. And when you're trying to become overly detailed, it takes on a simplistic view that you can lock down the budgets, the schedule, the scope, all at the beginning before you've even started, and that the success of your project is really going to be relying on being on time, on budget, delivery of these upfront and precisely planned set of features. And that's oftentimes not how this work actually goes once you start building. There are going to be changes in requirements. There's going to be interactions with your customers and your users and your stakeholders where they see what you're doing and they're going to maybe want to pivot. Or maybe the initial concept is not quite exactly on the mark and you have to make adjustments. So this is kind of dependent, I have to say, this is just my own opinion, on the actual scope and topic of your project. If you have something that is well defined, more traditional project management tools and techniques are sometimes even better than agile ones. If you have things that are loosely defined, are you trying to explore the market? Are you doing something that doesn't necessarily have a start and an end date and a well-defined budget to burn down? Well, then agile techniques are going to be probably a lot better for you in that scenario. It just depends a little bit there. But back to the text, Mike Cohn goes on to talk about how extensive requirements documents, upfront analysis work, overly detailed project plans, these are all things that get into investing a lot into documentation up before you even start writing code. And you're going to base all your estimates off that, and your estimate's still not going to be perfect. So you might get yourself into trouble there, or you could over-invest, and this is what I see actually happen a lot. You over-invest in the pre-project activities, and you're well into diminishing returns. So the point stands. I mean, it is a pitfall. Agile teams are going to choose to be closer to the left in a figure like this graph. We want to acknowledge that we can't eliminate uncertainty from the estimates and embrace the idea that small efforts can bring big rewards with them. That's the iterative approach to software development. And despite the fact that a lot of evidence shows that the person who's going to do the work is going to give you the best estimate for it, we still, in the agile software world, we want work to be estimated by the team as a whole. One, because we don't know necessarily who is the individual that is going to do that, especially if we're estimating a large chunk of work at once. So you don't necessarily know who's going to do the task, and so that might make it harder. And then second, everyone needs a little bit of help sometimes in getting caught of, hey, I'm either thinking this is too complicated, or I'm really missing some significant detail. And that's where the team coming in to estimate is going to help catch some of those things. You get that group mind on the problem, and you're going to get a little bit better insight when you look at it as a team together. Now, how do people estimate? What are we estimating? Typically, what we're going to put on is a value called story points. And the industry standard for this is to use the Fibonacci series. The Fibonacci series is a common approach used to model exponential growth. And the idea there is that as things become bigger, there's embedded within that more unknown, more risk of underestimating something, because the higher the level of complexity, the more things you're going to find out when the work actually starts. And so we skip over some of these things instead of just having a linear progression of the pointing series. You're going to increase from 1 to 2 to 3, then to 5, then to 8, and then 13. Typically within a user story, a story won't be pointed higher than a 13. At that point, we would say it's too big to execute within your 2-week or your 3-week Scrum sprint. And at that point, it's also just the level of bigness, the magnitude of that estimate is embedding so much unknown that it's not prudent for you to tackle the work. It's a level of ambiguity that you're going to want further refinement of those details. A lot of teams are even dropping 13 now. And when I started doing Agile, we had 13. It was basically a way of modeling that would take all sprint to complete. Now teams are dropping down to 8 as being the biggest. I will say that no matter what your maximum size is, from experience, it's probably good to break that down if you can. Having a max size story is going to lead to things taking longer than they need to. And I don't know if it's more common than not, but it is fairly common for a maximum sized user story to carry over into the next sprint, just by its nature. It's, kind of flip a coin. Is it going to actually fit within the sprint, or is it going to carry over longer? You estimate it at the maximum size. You just don't know. That being said, those are the most common series that people use to create story points. And there is another technique that Mike Cohn puts in the book, which would be to just simply double each value. 1, 2, 4, 8, then maybe to 16. I haven't seen it used in a professional team, but it's worth noting that that's in the book. And the thing that's kind of nice about that is it just has fewer values. If you were to use 1, 2, 4, and 8, it's getting closer to small, medium, large. And there's something to that, I think, in a little bit more simplicity. Because really, what's the difference between a 2 and a 3? It's tough to say. I don't know. It gets that level of granularity, it becomes almost meaningless. And going back to the original point, how much time are you going to spend discerning between those things? It's best for you just to pick a number and move on. So that leads us into some of the other point values you might see. So these are for user stories that you're going to pick up in the near term. You're going to do these in the next sprint. You're going to do these maybe 2 or 3 sprints from now. But there are other things in your backlog that will be user story or kind of requirement specifications that might be bigger and broader, oftentimes called features, epics, things like that. And those might be ambiguous to the point where they haven't actually been decomposed yet. And you might put a 13 on something like that. Sometimes you might do 20s, 40s, 100 points. These are going to be very roughly estimated. Consider it to have a very large standard deviation on what once you actually break it down, what's it actually going to shake out to. But still, some of those are something to be aware of that you might want to take a swag at estimating some of the bigger items in your backlog as well, just for longer range planning, really. All right, next up in this chapter, we're talking about 3 forms of deriving an estimate. And the 3 forms are the expert opinion, the analogy, and disaggregation. So the expert opinion, I'll put it to you this way, they're all expert opinion at the end of the day. The expert opinion really just is relying on an expert to provide his or her intuition, expertise, gut feel, and then provide that estimate on the basis of that they're a professional and they do this for a living and this is what they're thinking. The analogy is really still an expert opinion. However, it does utilize a little bit of help, you might say. And the idea here is to try to triangulate a size using recent work that your team has completed, in which what we're doing is we're saying, hey, we're looking at user story A, and we're going to pick up this work next sprint, and let's look back to work that we did last sprint. Is user story A bigger than user story X? Yeah, we think it's bigger. It's a bigger effort than that. What about user story Y that we did last sprint? Well, it's not quite as big as that. So we know it's between X and Y, and that might lead us to believe, okay, well then this lands at a 5, or whatever value it may happen to occupy. That's the triangulation concept, and it uses recently completed work as a means for estimating the size of user story. And when this is valuable for user stories, where this technique is actually, in my opinion, the best utilized is in epic planning, project planning. When you have a larger effort for a feature, project, etc., whatever your big chunk of work is, whatever word you want to use for that, using something similar, actual historical data that there's a track record of, is going to be a lot better than trying to use this kind of relative sizing in and of itself. Because the thing that you're going to find is that not only are you going to have some estimate of relative story points, etc., for a previous project, you're going to have actuals on how long that actually took you to do, and what was your backlog growth, how much new requirements and how many new user stories did you have to generate that you didn't think of in the initial planning phase. That's another factor to keep in mind. And so that analogy at the larger scale, I think, is actually one of the best techniques. Sorry for the digression there. The last one is the last form of deriving an estimate. Number 3 is called disaggregation, in which this is where you would decompose a story down into tasks and estimate the size of each of the tasks and then try to piece them back together again. This is also a technique that's good to use when your user story is actually too big. Maybe it's a 13, maybe it's a 21, and you need to break it down into more manageable pieces for a team to actually execute within the time of your sprint. So disaggregation works in a few different applications as well. One of the teams that I had actually really great success with doing, we did a combination of these. So we would do expert opinion, where we would estimate how many story points do we think that something is. And then we would do a disaggregation in terms of the tasks that needed to happen, and we would estimate those in actual hours. I guess that would be what this book refers to as ideal days, but actually ideal time in hours. And we would track both of those along the way. We would watch burn down of story points, but we would also watch burn down of estimated hours and how accurate was that to the actual time that took when they were clocking time on projects. That's a detail that your organization may or may not want to do, tracking hours. Sometimes it's not desirable to do that. Sometimes it is. I'm a big proponent of it, although it's more tedious. As long as it's being used judiciously, it's not becoming cumbersome, and it's not being used to, grind people into dust, to making sure that you're squeezing as much work out of them as possible. There are ways it can be abused, but if you're doing it judiciously, it gives you a good data point that you otherwise wouldn't have for tracking your projects. All right, so last thing in the book is about how we think about actually getting these estimates as a team. And the most common way of doing this is called pointing poker. And they used to have actual decks of cards that you would get and utilize to work with your teams in person. But now that we're in a remote world, there's a bunch of free tools online. You can get plugins probably for your project management software. You can use free sites like pointingpoker.com or whatever. Here's a screenshot of what that looks like. So you create a session, you get your team to log in, and everybody, you'll discuss the user story. Everybody anonymously votes for what they think, and then you can reveal what everybody's votes were and see where everybody lands. And the goal here, what you're really looking for, is to see, did we cluster around the same thing? Everybody's thinking it's a 5 or an 8. Then we can have a discussion. Is it a 5 or is it an 8? Developer A says, well, I think it's an 8 because of this extra work. Developer B says, oh, I didn't think about that task. I agree, it's an 8. It's just a discussion to have. And hopefully you're clustering really closely together and you're just moving along quickly. The other thing that's nice about these story point estimates is it gives you an opportunity to find where there's disparate thinking. When somebody thinks it's a 1 and somebody thinks it's a 5, that indicates that there's a serious kind of misunderstanding about what the scope of that user story is, or something else is amiss. And that indicates that we need to talk about it more. So it's a good gut check for requirements people. It's a good gut check for teams before they head into a planning, or even during the planning if necessary, for estimating what's the size of your work. So that's all we've got for you. That's Chapter 6, Techniques for Agile Estimation. Let me know what you think. Leave a comment below. Till next time.